The Frozen Mile. Marcus Callahan had been driving the Dalton Highway for 12 years, hauling supplies to Proto Bay through conditions that would break most men. February 2019 brought temperatures that plunged to 60 below zero, the kind of cold that turned diesel to jelly and made tire rubber shatter like glass. Marcus knew this route better than he knew his own home in Fairbanks. Every curve, every mile marker, every place where the wind howled across the tundra with enough force to flip an empty trailer. He left Coldfoot at 4 a.m., his Peterbilt's engine block heater working overtime just to keep the rig running. The GPS showed 244 miles to Deadhorse, a straight shot through the Brooks Range that he'd made hundreds of times. By 6 a.m., he was passing mile marker 187, watching the odometer tick forward as he climbed toward Atagun Pass. The darkness was absolute, his headlights carving tunnels through blackness that seemed to swallow light itself. That's when he noticed something wrong. The GPS still showed him at mile marker 187. He glanced at his odometer. It had advanced 3 miles. He assumed it was a GPS glitch common enough in the Arctic where satellite signals bounced strangely off the ionosphere. But 10 minutes later, the GPS still read mile marker 187. His odometer showed he'd traveled 8 miles. The landscape outside looked identical, the same configuration of rocks and snow-covered slopes that he'd been passing for what should have been 15 minutes of driving. Marcus grabbed his CB radio. "Any northbound traffic, this is Polar Bear 7, you copy?" Static answered him. He tried the emergency channel. Nothing but the hiss of dead air. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual, but the wrongness of the situation made his hands sweat inside his insulated gloves. He drove for another hour. The GPS never changed from mile marker 187. His odometer showed he'd traveled 63 miles. The fuel gauge hadn't moved, still showing 3/4 of a tank, exactly where it had been when he left Coldfoot. Outside, the same geological formations repeated endlessly. A distinctive 3-peaked ridge that he recognized passing by his window again and again and again. The temperature gauge in his cab began to drop despite the heater running full blast. Marcus could see his breath now. White clouds forming in air that had been warm moments before. Ice began forming on the inside of his windows in fractal patterns that spread too quickly, as if the cold outside had found a way through the glass without breaking it. He cranked the heater higher, but frost continued to creep across every surface. Then he saw the other truck. It was a Peterbilt identical to his own, same blue paint job, same configuration. It was parked on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights flashing. As Marcus approached, his headlights illuminated the cab. A driver sat behind the wheel, motionless, staring straight ahead. Marcus slowed, pulling onto the shoulder behind the stopped truck. The driver in the other cab didn't move, didn't turn to look at him. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and opened his door. The cold that hit him was beyond anything he'd experienced, a physical force that seemed to strip heat from his body at the molecular level. He could feel ice forming in his lungs with each breath. He approached the other truck, shining his light through the driver's window. The driver was frozen solid, skin blue-white, eyes wide open and glazed with ice. But that wasn't what made Marcus's blood turn to water in his veins. The frozen driver was him. Same face, same scar on his left cheek from a bar fight in Anchorage 15 years ago. Same company jacket with his name embroidered on the chest. The frozen Marcus stared straight ahead, hands locked on the wheel in a death grip. Marcus stumbled backward, nearly falling on the ice-covered road. He ran back to his truck, scrambling into the cab and slamming the door. His hands shook so badly he could barely turn the key, but the engine roared to life. He threw the transmission into gear and accelerated, watching the frozen version of himself disappear in his mirrors. The GPS still showed mile marker 187, but now there were 2 stopped trucks on the shoulder behind him, both with their hazard lights flashing. Marcus pushed the accelerator harder, the engine screaming as he climbed through gears. The temperature in his cab continued to drop. Ice spread across the dashboard, across his hands on the wheel. He could feel his joints stiffening, his movements becoming slower. Ahead, another truck sat on the shoulder. Then another. And another. All identical Peterbilts. All with frozen drivers behind the wheel. Marcus counted 15 of them before he stopped counting. Before the cold became so intense that thinking required effort he couldn't spare. His mirrors showed an infinite line of stopped trucks stretching behind him into the darkness, all of them him. All of them frozen, all of them trapped on mile marker 187. The fuel gauge finally moved. It dropped to empty in 30 seconds. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. Momentum carried Marcus forward for another quarter mile before the truck rolled to a stop. He tried the starter. Nothing. The electrical systems were dead. Ice covered every surface inside the cab now, including his clothes, his skin. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, feel his thoughts fragmenting like ice crystals forming in his brain. Through the windshield, he saw another truck approaching from behind, headlights growing larger in the pre-dawn darkness. It would find him here, frozen behind the wheel, just another stopped truck on mile marker 187. And then that driver would see something that would make them run back to their own truck, would make them accelerate away into the endless frozen mile, would eventually lead them to this same spot, this same moment, this same fate. Marcus understood now. The road had claimed him, was claiming him, would always claim him. He existed in all moments simultaneously on this stretch of highway. The Marcus driving toward his fate, the Marcus discovering his frozen self, the Marcus becoming frozen, the Marcus who had been frozen here for eternity. Time had collapsed on mile marker 187, folding in on itself like paper in a fire, trapping him in an infinite loop of ice and darkness. His last thought before the cold stopped his thoughts entirely was that somewhere ahead, another Marcus Callahan was leaving Coldfoot at 4 a.m., GPS showing a clear route to Dead Horse, completely unaware that he was driving toward mile marker 187, where he would find himself frozen behind the wheel of an identical truck, and where he would become just another marker in an infinite line of frozen drivers stretching into the darkness, all wearing his face, all trapped in the same eternal moment of recognition and horror. The highway claimed him. It always had. It always would. Story number 2, the Cannery shift. Jennifer Ortiz took the job at the salmon cannery in Dillingham because it paid $18 an hour and asked no questions about her past. She'd come to Alaska to disappear, to put 3,000 miles between herself and mistakes that followed her like shadows. The Bristol Bay fisheries operated 24 hours a day during the summer season, and Jennifer signed up for the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 a.m., processing king salmon that came off the boats in endless silver waves. The cannery sat on pilings over the water, a massive corrugated metal building that smelled like fish guts and diesel fuel. Jennifer worked the gutting line with 11 other people, most of them seasonal workers like herself, all of them desperate enough to stand in fish blood and slime for 8 hours while seagulls screamed outside and the Bering Sea wind rattled the metal walls. Her supervisor was a man named Dutch Koenig, 65 years old with hands like scarred leather and eyes that had seen too many seasons. The work was mindless, repetitive, perfect for someone who wanted to shut off their brain and just exist. Grab salmon from the conveyor, slice belly, pull guts, toss fish to the next station, repeat. Jennifer could process 40 fish per minute by her 3rd week. Her hands moved automatically while her mind drifted through memories and regrets. On July 23, 2016, Dutch called her into his office at the start of her shift. "We got a special job tonight," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Private client off the books. You interested in making an extra $500 cash? Jennifer needed the money. Her crappy room at the bunkhouse cost more than she'd expected, and her car needed brake work. She nodded. Dutch took her to a section of the cannery she'd never seen before, a wing that extended further out over the water. The corridor leading to it was dimly lit, the walls covered in rust stains that looked disturbingly organic in the flickering fluorescent light. "You'll be working alone," Dutch said. "Process whatever comes down the line. Don't ask questions. Be done by 8 a.m. The processing room was identical to the main floor, just smaller. One conveyor belt, one gutting station, one output chute. Industrial lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that somehow made the shadows in the corners seem darker. Dutch left without another word, and Jennifer heard the door lock behind him. She waited. At 12:30 a.m., the conveyor belt lurched to life with a grinding mechanical sound. The first salmon came down the line. Jennifer grabbed it, made her cuts, pulled the guts. Normal. The second fish was the same. By the fifth fish, she'd fallen into her usual rhythm, hands moving automatically, mind elsewhere. The 10th fish was wrong. She couldn't identify what made it wrong initially. It was the right size, right color, but something about it made her stomach turn. She made her cut, and the smell that hit her was nothing like fish. It was sweet, cloying, with an undertone of corruption that made her gag. The guts she pulled out were the wrong color, dark purple instead of pink-red, and they were warm, far warmer than they should have been. Jennifer tossed the fish to the output chute and grabbed the next one. Also wrong. The scales felt different under her fingers, slightly rough, almost like human skin. She tried to tell herself it was just a different species, that the cannery sometimes processed odd catches, but her hands shook as she made the cut. The smell got worse. Each fish released that sweet, rotten odor that filled the processing room until Jennifer's eyes watered. The guts were increasingly wrong, strange shapes, unfamiliar organs, colors that fish didn't have. By the 20th fish, she found something that looked disturbingly like a human finger among the innards, small and pale and perfectly formed. She stared at it for a full minute before tossing it down the chute with everything else, telling herself it was a deformity, a mutation, anything but what it looked like. The conveyor belt brought more. The fish started changing. Scales gave way to smooth skin in patches. The heads became misshapen, eyes too large and positioned wrong. One had what looked like lips, human lips, on a salmon's face. Another had tiny hands instead of pectoral fins, complete with fingernails and delicate bones that crunched when Jennifer grabbed it. She should have stopped, should have walked away. But $500 was $500, and something in her brain had shut down, some protective circuit that let her hands keep working while her mind retreated to a quiet place where nothing was real. She processed fish after fish after fish, each one more wrong than the last. At 3 a.m., the fish coming down the conveyor were only barely fish anymore. They had human faces, malformed and screaming, mouths opening and closing even though they were dead. They had arms that reached for her, fingers that grasped at nothing. Jennifer's hands kept moving, kept cutting, kept pulling out organs that looked increasingly human. Lungs, a heart that was the wrong size, intestines that were arranged almost correctly. She found a wallet inside one. She didn't open it. Dropped it down the chute with the guts and kept working. At 5 a.m., the things coming down the conveyor weren't fish at all anymore. They were children, small and pale and waterlogged, skin covered in scales and patches, gills on their necks opening and closing slowly. Jennifer processed them. She couldn't stop. Her hands moved automatically, making the cuts she'd made 10,000 times, pulling out the guts, tossing the bodies to the output chute. Some of them moved when she cut them, some of them made sounds. The sun rose at 6:30 a.m., gray light filtering through the salt-stained windows. The conveyor belt continued. The things stopped looking like anything recognizable. Masses of flesh and bone and scale, human and fish and something else entirely. Biological impossibilities that couldn't exist but did, that moved and breathed and bled under her knife. At 8 a.m. exactly, the conveyor belt stopped. Jennifer stood in blood and slime that came up to her ankles. Her hands continued making cutting motions even though there was nothing to cut. Dutch opened the door. "Good work," he said, handing her an envelope. "Same time tomorrow?" Jennifer looked at the envelope. 5 $100 bills, crisp and clean. She looked at her hands covered in blood that was the wrong color. She looked at Dutch, whose eyes were completely empty like windows into a room with nothing inside. She took the money. She came back the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the season, she'd made $15,000 in cash, and her hands moved constantly, always making cutting motions, even when she slept, even when she ate. She couldn't stop seeing their faces, if they were faces. Couldn't stop smelling that sweet, rotten smell that now seemed to come from inside her own body. Jennifer never left Alaska. She's still in Dillingham, still working graveyard shift at the Cannery because once you've processed the catch from the deep waters of Bristol Bay, once you've gutted the things that swim in the darkness beneath the Bering Sea, there's nowhere else you can work, nothing else you can do. Your hands know the motions. Your mind knows the truth. And Dutch always needs workers who don't ask questions, who show up on time, who can process 40 per minute no matter what comes down the line. Story 3, the permafrost house. Daniel Reeves bought the house in talk for $30,000, which should have been his first warning. In Alaska, where real estate was expensive and housing scarce, a 3-bedroom house with a garage and 5 acres for the price of a used pickup truck meant something was deeply wrong. But Daniel was fresh out of Anchorage, tired of paying $2,000 a month for a studio apartment, and convinced that he could handle anything Alaska threw at him. He was 28 years old and stupid with confidence. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia who chain-smoked throughout the showing, mentioned that the previous owner had left suddenly. "Family emergency," she said, not meeting his eyes. Left everything behind. Daniel walked through rooms furnished with someone else's life, dishes in the cupboards, clothes in the closets, family photos on the walls showing a smiling couple and 2 young children. The power was on. The water ran. Everything functioned. It felt like the family had simply vanished mid-breakfast one morning. Daniel signed the papers on March 15, 2018, and moved in the next day. The house sat on the edge of town where the trees pressed close and the nearest neighbor was 2 miles down a dirt road. It was built in the 1970s, constructed on pilings driven deep into the permafrost, standard practice in interior Alaska where the ground froze solid and stayed that way. The crawl space beneath the house was 3 feet high, accessible through a hatch in the floor of the hallway closet. Everything was fine for the first week. Daniel set up his computer, started his remote programming job, settled into the rhythm of rural Alaska life. The house was quiet, well-insulated, comfortable. At night he heard the usual sounds: wind in the trees, the settling of wood, the occasional creak of the pilings adjusting to temperature changes. On his 8th night, Daniel woke at 3 a.m. to scratching sounds beneath the floor. Not the scrabbling of animals, but deliberate, methodical scratching like fingernails on wood. It moved around under the house following the path of his hallway. He lay in bed listening, telling himself it was a fox or a porcupine that had gotten into the crawl space. In the morning, he checked the access hatch. It was secured, undisturbed. The scratching came back the next night and the next. Always at 3 a.m., always following the same path, down the hallway into his bedroom, stopping directly beneath his bed. Daniel tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible. After a week of this, he grabbed a flashlight and opened the access hatch, determined to find whatever animal was making the noise and remove it. The crawl space was dark and cold, his breath forming clouds in the beam of his flashlight. Permafrost gleamed dully a foot below the house's support structure, ice that had been frozen for 10,000 years. Daniel crawled forward on his belly, checking for holes where an animal might have entered. He found nothing. The crawl space was sealed tight. But he found something else. Scratches on the underside of his bedroom floor, deep gouges in the wood, hundreds of them covering a 10-foot area directly beneath where he slept. The wood was shredded in places, nearly gouged through. And in the beam of his flashlight, he saw something that made his throat close with terror. The scratches were fresh, splinters of new wood scattered on the permafrost beneath them, some of the gouges still bleeding sap. Daniel backed out of the crawl space quickly, sealed the hatch, and pushed the previous owner's winter coats over it. That night, he slept in the living room on the couch. At 3 a.m., the scratching started. It was in the crawl space beneath the living room now, directly under him, following him, finding him. He left the house and checked into a motel in town. At 3 a.m., lying in the motel bed, he heard scratching beneath him. Faint but unmistakable, the sound traveling through the building's foundation, through earth and distance, finding him wherever he went. Daniel called Patricia the next morning. "What happened to the previous owners?" he demanded. She was silent for a long time. Finally, she said, "They found the boy's body in the permafrost under the house. He'd been there for 40 years, frozen, perfectly preserved. The permafrost shifted during a warm summer and he sort of rose up. The previous owners saw him through the access hatch, his face pressed against the clear ice, looking up at them." "Who was he?" Daniel asked, though he already knew he didn't want the answer. "They never identified him. No missing persons reports matched. He was maybe 8 years old, had been frozen alive based on the expression on his face and the position of his body. Arms up, fingers extended like he'd been scratching at something. The police removed the body, but..." Patricia paused. "The family left that night, never came back for their things. The father told me the scratching started as soon as the body was removed. Said it would never stop because the boy was still down there, still frozen, still trying to get out." Daniel went back to the house in daylight, opened the access hatch, and crawled into the crawl space with a shovel. He found the place where the permafrost showed disturbance, where the police had cut into the ice to remove the body. The hole had refrozen, but the ice was clear there, clear as glass. Daniel shone his light down into it. The boy was still there, not the body that had been removed, but the impression of the body, a hollow in the ice shaped exactly like a small human form, arms raised, fingers spread. And as Daniel watched, frost began forming in the hollow, building up, filling in the shape with new ice, slowly, molecule by molecule, rebuilding something that had been taken away. He ran, left everything, his furniture, his clothes, his computer, his life. The house in talk still sits there, listed for sale at $20,000 now, price dropping every year. The crawlspace access hatch is sealed with duct tape and a handwritten sign that says, "Do not open." The scratching continues every night at 3 a.m., methodical and patient, the sound of small fingers trying to reach the surface, trying to complete a journey that was interrupted 40 years ago when the permafrost took a child and held him and wouldn't let him finish dying. Daniel lives in Fairbanks now, in a high-rise apartment on the 10th floor, as far from the ground as he can get. But some nights, when the temperature drops below zero and the ground freezes hard, he hears it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of scratching, of small fingers working through ice and wood and earth and distance, following him, finding him, patient and eternal and inevitable. The permafrost remembers. The permafrost never forgets. And what it takes, it keeps, until the ice decides otherwise. Story number 4, The Aurora Station. Kevin Hartwell worked as a meteorologist at a remote research station 70 miles north of Fairbanks, one of 6 people manning an isolated facility that monitored atmospheric conditions and studied auroral phenomena. The station consisted of 3 buildings connected by heated tunnels: living quarters, laboratory, and the observation dome, where banks of computers recorded data from instruments scattered across 50 square miles of wilderness. December 2017 brought the kind of cold that made the air itself seem brittle, temperatures holding steady at 45 below zero for weeks. Kevin had the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. monitoring equipment while the others slept. He liked the solitude, the quiet hum of electronics, the vast darkness beyond the observation dome's windows. On clear nights, the aurora danced overhead, green and purple curtains of light that stretched across the entire sky. He'd been recording them for 3 years and never tired of the beauty. On December 18th, the instruments detected an anomaly. The magnetosphere reading spiked far beyond normal parameters, showing distortions that shouldn't have been possible. Kevin checked the equipment, ran diagnostics, confirmed everything was functioning correctly. The readings were real. Something was happening to the Earth's magnetic field directly above the station, a concentrated distortion that bent the field lines into impossible configurations. The aurora came down. Not metaphorically, it literally descended from the ionosphere, dropping lower and lower until curtains of light hung barely 100 feet above the snow. Kevin had never seen anything like it. Aurora should occur at altitudes of 60 to 200 miles up, where solar wind particles collided with oxygen and nitrogen. What he was watching violated every principle of atmospheric physics he'd studied. He grabbed his radio. "Base, this is observation. You need to see this." No response. He tried again. Static. The interference from the magnetic distortion must have been blocking the signal. Kevin made a decision. He'd wake them, manually. This was too important to wait. He left the observation dome and entered the tunnel leading to the living quarters. Halfway through, the lights flickered and died. His flashlight showed the tunnel stretching ahead, walls of corrugated metal reflecting the beam. But something was wrong with the reflections. They showed the tunnel extending much further than it should have, perspective distorted as if the walls had somehow stretched during the moment of darkness. Kevin walked forward. His footsteps echoed wrong, the sound returning too late, as if the tunnel had become vastly longer. His flashlight beam couldn't find the far end. He walked for 5 minutes, then 10, passing distance markers that made no sense. He'd walked nearly a quarter mile through a tunnel that was supposed to be 50 yards long. He turned back. The door to the observation dome was gone. The tunnel extended infinitely in both directions now, stretching away into darkness that swallowed his flashlight beam. Kevin ran. The tunnel ran with him, distances meaningless, his footsteps echoing from directions that shouldn't exist. The aurora found him there. It came through the walls, through solid metal and insulation, impossible curtains of green and purple light that hung in the tunnel like frozen waterfalls. Kevin could hear them now. He'd never heard aurora before, but these made sounds, deep bass frequencies that resonated in his chest and higher crystalline notes that made his teeth ache. The light touched his skin, and where it touched, his skin glowed phosphorescent green, as if he were becoming part of the aurora itself. He saw them in the light, figures humanoid but wrong, made of pure luminescence, with too many joints in their limbs and faces that shifted and changed as he looked at them. They moved through the tunnel walls like the walls were mist, gathering around him, reaching toward him with fingers that stretched impossibly long. Where they touched him, his skin went numb, then began to fade, becoming translucent, the bones visible beneath like shadows in fog. Kevin ran through aurora that filled the tunnel now, through light so bright it should have blinded him, but instead showed him too much. He could see through the walls, through the earth, down into the bedrock and deeper into vast spaces that shouldn't exist beneath Alaska. Enormous caverns filled with more aurora, with thousands of the luminescent figures moving in patterns that hurt to perceive because they moved through more than 3 dimensions, folding through spaces that connected to elsewhere. He found a door, finally, after running forever through the endless tunnel. It opened onto the laboratory building, but the laboratory was wrong. The equipment was different, unfamiliar, the walls covered in writings he couldn't read, the windows showing a landscape that wasn't Alaska. The sky outside was full of aurora that moved like living things, vast serpents of light, coiling through clouds that rained upward, defying gravity. The other researchers were there, or things wearing their faces. They turned to look at him with eyes that glowed green, skin phosphorescent, and Kevin saw that they were translucent now, barely solid, halfway between matter and light. "You can't fight it," said something with his colleague Sarah's voice. "The aurora takes what it touches. We've been here for years, Kevin. Decades. Time works differently under the light." Kevin looked at his hands. They were translucent now, glowing, fading. He could see the structure of the bones, the flow of blood, the electrical impulses racing through nerves. And deeper, he could see other things. Memories that weren't his. Experiences from perspectives that weren't human. Knowledge that came from the vast luminescent figures he'd seen in the spaces beneath the earth. The aurora was alive. Had always been alive. The dancing lights humans watched from below were just the visible edge of something vast and old and incomprehensibly aware that lived in the magnetosphere and sometimes descended to touch the world and take things back up with it. People, places, moments frozen in time and pulled into the light. Kevin tried to run again, but running meant nothing now. The observation dome, the laboratory, the living quarters, they all occupied the same space simultaneously, folded together by geometry that Aurora understood but humans couldn't perceive. He was in all the rooms at once, existing in multiple locations, his body stretched across impossible distances while remaining in one place. The sun rose at 10 a.m., and the aurora faded with the daylight. Kevin found himself standing in the observation dome again, equipment humming normally, the overnight shift over. He checked his watch, 6 a.m. exactly. 8 hours had passed, no more, no less. The tunnel to the living quarters was 50 yards long, properly lit, normal. The other researchers emerged, yawning, complaining about the cold, showing no signs of translucence or awareness. But Kevin was changed. His skin still glowed faintly in darkness, barely visible like phosphorescence from deep-sea creatures. When he closed his eyes, he could see the aurora even in daylight, could see it stretching down to touch the earth in places all over Alaska, could see the figures moving in spaces beneath the world. And he could hear them calling in frequencies below human hearing, calling for him to return, to complete the transition he'd started, to join them in the light. He left the research station the next day, caught a flight to Seattle, then to California, then to Mexico, trying to get as far from the Arctic as possible. But distance meant nothing. On clear nights, he could still see the aurora, even from the equator where it shouldn't be visible, dancing at the edge of his vision, patient and inevitable. His skin became more translucent each month, his body lighter, as if he were slowly becoming something else. Something made of light and energy instead of flesh and bone. Kevin knows he'll go back eventually. The aurora took part of him that night in the tunnel, took something essential, and what the aurora takes, it keeps. One day, probably soon, probably on a night when the magnetic field distorts just right and the lights dance bright, he'll simply fade from the world, becoming translucent and then transparent and then nothing but light, joining the thousands of others who touched the aurora and were touched in return, who dance now in the magnetosphere, visible from Earth as the northern lights. Forever trapped, forever free, forever falling through spaces between dimensions while the world below watches and calls it beautiful. Story number 5. The Cache Creek Accident. Raymond Torres had been flying bush planes in Alaska for 32 years, hauling supplies to remote villages, transporting hunters and fishermen, evacuating medical emergencies from places with no roads and no hope except for the sound of his de Havilland Beaver's engine cutting through the wilderness. He knew every mountain pass, every gravel strip, every weather pattern between Anchorage and Nome. August 14, 2015 brought perfect flying conditions. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. The job was routine. Pick up 3 hunters from a camp near Cache Creek, 40 miles northwest of Talkeetna, and return them to Anchorage. Raymond had flown this route 200 times, knew the landmarks, the fork in the creek, the distinctive granite outcropping that looked like a bear's head, the gravel bar where he'd land the beaver and load his passengers. The hunters had paid in advance, provided GPS coordinates, confirmed by radio that morning that they were ready for pickup. Raymond found the coordinates easily. The landscape matched what he expected. Dense spruce forest, mountains rising to the north, Cache Creek winding through the valley. But the gravel bar was empty. No hunters, no camp, no sign anyone had been there. He circled twice, checking his GPS. The coordinates were correct. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He landed anyway, taxiing the beaver to the edge of the gravel bar and cutting the engine. The silence of the wilderness wrapped around him, broken only by the creek's burble and wind in the trees. Raymond grabbed his radio. Anchorage base, this is Beaver 279er. At pickup coordinates but no passengers visible, requesting confirmation. Static answered. He tried again. Nothing but the hiss of dead air. His satellite phone showed no signal, which was impossible. Satellite phones worked everywhere. Raymond climbed out of the plane, walking the gravel bar, looking for any sign of the hunters. He found their camp 100 yards into the tree line. 3 tents, gear scattered, a fire ring with cold ashes. But no people. Their equipment was all there, expensive rifles leaning against trees, backpacks full of supplies, even their GPS units and radios. Everything except the humans who should have been using it. Then Raymond noticed something that made his skin crawl. One of the tents was partially collapsed, the fabric shredded from the inside as if someone had clawed their way out in a panic. Dark stains covered the sleeping bag inside, stains that looked like blood but were the wrong color, too dark, almost black, with an iridescent sheen like oil on water. He heard the sound of his plane's engine starting. Raymond ran back to the gravel bar, emerging from the trees to see his beaver taxiing away from shore, moving toward the creek, building speed for takeoff. Through the cockpit windows, he could see someone in the pilot's seat, hands on the controls. But the figure was wrong. Too tall, shoulders too broad, head shaped incorrectly. The plane lifted off, climbing away from the valley. Raymond screamed, waving his arms, but the beaver continued its climb, banking east toward Anchorage, carrying away his only means of escape. He stood on the gravel bar, watching until it disappeared beyond the mountains, the sound of its engine fading to nothing, leaving him in silence. Raymond walked back to the camp, trying to think, trying to plan. He had survival gear, food for 3 days, water purification tablets. Someone would come looking for him when he didn't return. He just had to wait, stay calm, stay rational. He checked the hunter's gear more carefully, looking for their satellite phones. He found 3 of them. None would power on, despite showing fully charged batteries. Night fell fast in the valley. Raymond built a fire using the hunter's supplies, the flames pushing back darkness that seemed too complete, too solid. He tried to sleep in one of the intact tents, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At 2 a.m., he heard something moving through the camp, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. Three figures stood at the edge of the firelight. They wore the hunter's clothes, had the hunter's builds, but their faces were wrong. Features blurred and indistinct like reflections in disturbed water. Eyes that caught the firelight and reflected it back wrong, showing colors that eyes shouldn't show. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there swaying slightly as if they were puppets and the puppeteer hadn't quite mastered the motion. "Who are you?" Raymond demanded, his voice breaking. The figures tilted their heads in unison, the motion jerky and insectile. One of them spoke, voice echoing strangely, coming from multiple directions at once. "We're the hunters. You're here to pick us up." But the mouth didn't move right, the words not syncing with the motion of the lips. Raymond ran. He grabbed his pack and flashlight and ran into the forest, branches tearing at his face, roots trying to trip him. Behind him, he could hear them following, not running, just walking with that same slow, deliberate pace, but somehow keeping up no matter how fast he moved. The forest closed around him, trees pressing closer, darkness absolute beyond his flashlight's beam. He ran for hours, his lungs burning, legs screaming, but the valley never ended. He should have reached the far ridgeline, should have found the park's highway, or at least signs of civilization. Instead, the forest continued, endless. The same configuration of trees and undergrowth repeating. His flashlight beam showed him passing the same distinctive birch tree with a lightning scar 5 times, each time approaching it from a different direction. Dawn came gray and cold. Raymond found himself back at the gravel bar, his plane gone, the camp waiting. The 3 figures stood at the tree line watching him with their wrong eyes. One of them held up his satellite phone, Raymond's phone from his plane. How did they have it? And said in that multi-directional voice, "Anchorage Base, this is Beaver 279er. Pickup complete, returning with 3 passengers." Raymond understood then. They weren't taking his identity, they were replacing him. The plane flying toward Anchorage carried him. The Raymond who would land and complete his paperwork and go home to his wife and think nothing was wrong. And another Raymond, the one he was now, would remain here, would become another set of wrong features and blurred identity, would wait at this gravel bar for the next pilot who came to pick up hunters that didn't exist. He tried to leave the valley again, and again. Each time he found himself back at the camp, each time another piece of himself felt wrong. His hands moved with a delay he could perceive. His voice echoed strangely when he spoke. His reflection in the creek showed features that were blurring, becoming indistinct. The other figures welcomed him with gestures that were almost human, showed him the patterns they walked through the forest, the endless circle that kept them in the valley, the routine of waiting for pilots who would become them and leave versions of themselves behind. Raymond Torres is still there in the valley near Cache Creek, waiting at the gravel bar with the others. When pilots receive requests for pickup at those coordinates, and they do receive them regularly, calls coming from voices that sound almost right but not quite, most have learned to refuse the job. The smart ones check the records, see that Raymond Torres was the last confirmed pilot to visit that location, see that he completed his flight and landed safely in Anchorage and retired 3 years later, and currently lives in Arizona with his wife. But some pilots don't check. Some pilots take the job, find the coordinates, land on the gravel bar, and they find hunters waiting, 3 or 4 or 5 of them now, features blurred, eyes wrong, offering to be transported back to civilization. And the pilots who are smart run, immediately leave their planes, flee into the forest. The pilots who aren't smart help load the gear, perform their pre-flight checks, notice too late that their passengers are sitting in the pilot's seat now, are starting the engine, are preparing for takeoff, while the real pilot stands on the gravel bar watching themselves fly away. Feeling their features begin to blur, understanding with dawning horror that they'll be waiting here now. waiting for the next pilot, waiting forever in the valley where something catches identities like nets catch fish and wears them like masks and sends reflections of you into the world while keeping the original, always keeping the original, building its collection of almost humans who pace the forest and wait at the gravel bar and call for more pilots on radios that no longer exist. Story number 6, the Whittier Tunnel. Sarah Brennan had driven through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel dozens of times, hauling freight between Anchorage and Whittier. The tunnel was a nightmare of logistics, 2.5 miles long, single lane, shared between trains and vehicles, operating on a strict schedule that alternated directions every half hour. But it was the only road connection to Whittier, the only way in or out of the isolated port town unless you took a boat or helicopter. March 22, 2020 brought heavy snow and winds that rattled her rig as she waited at the tunnel entrance for the 8 p.m. vehicle passage to Whittier. The signal light turned green at exactly 8 p.m. Sarah shifted into gear, her Freightliner's engine rumbling as she entered the tunnel. The Anton Anderson was unique, originally built for trains, converted for vehicle use. Walls of raw granite close enough to scrape paint if you weren't careful. Lighting strips on the ceiling provided dim illumination, but shadows pooled in the uneven rock surfaces, making the tunnel feel like driving through a throat. Sarah was a quarter mile in when her headlights illuminated something on the road ahead. A car stopped in the tunnel, hazard lights flashing. She slowed, pulling up behind it. A Subaru wagon with Anchorage plates, engine running, driver's door hanging open. Nobody visible inside or around it. Her CB radio crackled. "All traffic, this is tunnel control. Obstruction reported in the tunnel. Hold position. Emergency crew dispatched." Sarah grabbed her flashlight and climbed out of her cab. The tunnel was cold, her breath forming clouds in the light. She approached the Subaru, shining her light inside. Keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, phone in the cup holder showing a half-finished text message. The driver had been there seconds ago, had just disappeared in the time it took Sarah to stop her truck. "Tunnel control, this is Freight 7. Got an abandoned vehicle, no sign of the driver." Her radio hissed static. She tried again. Nothing. Her cell phone showed no signal, normal for the tunnel. Sarah walked forward, checking the road ahead, expecting to find someone who'd gotten out to check a tire or look at the engine. The tunnel stretched ahead, lights creating pools of pale yellow in the darkness. She found the second car 50 yards further, a Ford pickup, also abandoned. Driver's door open, engine running, headlights cutting through the dark. Then a third vehicle, a minivan with child seats in the back, cartoon character stickers on the windows, doors locked but empty, keys visible on the dashboard inside. Then more cars, a line of abandoned vehicles stretching forward into the tunnel, all with open doors or running engines or half-finished actions that suggested their occupants had vanished mid-moment. Sarah ran back to her truck, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the tunnel walls. She'd get in the cab, back up, get out of this nightmare. But when she reached where her Freightliner should have been, she found empty tunnel. Her truck was gone. The Subaru she'd initially stopped behind was gone. The tunnel stretched in both directions, no vehicles visible, just bare road and harsh lighting and walls that seemed to press closer. Her radio crackled again, but the voice that came through wasn't tunnel control. It was her own voice, her exact tone and inflection saying, "Freight 7 reporting, passed through tunnel successfully, no issues encountered." Sarah grabbed the radio. "That's not me, I'm still in the tunnel." But her transmission went nowhere and the radio fell silent except for quiet static. She walked. She didn't know what else to do. The tunnel couldn't be endless, it was 2.5 miles long. She could walk that in 40 minutes. She'd reach Whittier, find help, figure out what was happening. Her footsteps echoed wrong, the sound returning too quickly and too late simultaneously, as if the tunnel was both shorter and longer than it should be. The first door appeared after she'd walked for 30 minutes. It shouldn't exist. The tunnel was bored through solid granite. There were no doors, no side passages, just a straight shot through the mountain. But there it was, set into the rock wall, old and wooden and wrong, brass handle green with age. Sarah tried it, locked. She continued walking. More doors appeared, one every 100 feet, all different, some metal, some wood. Some that looked like they belonged on houses or offices or ships. None would open. Sarah stopped trying after the 10th door, just walked past them, counting them, using them as distance markers. At 20 doors, she should have been out of the tunnel. At 30 doors, she should have walked 5 miles. She kept walking. The tunnel changed. The lights became older, gas lamps instead of modern LEDs, casting flickering yellow light that made the shadows dance. The road surface changed from asphalt to gravel to dirt to something that looked like it had been paved a century ago, bricks worn smooth by traffic. The walls showed tool marks from hand drilling, work that predated the tunnel's 1940s construction. Sarah found them at the 40th door. People, dozens of them, sitting against the tunnel walls or standing in groups, all wearing clothes from different eras. She saw a woman in a 1950s dress, a man in 1990s flannel, children in outfits that could have been from any decade. They all had the same expression, blank, waiting, eyes focused on nothing. "What is this?" Sarah demanded. "What happened?" None of them responded. She grabbed the nearest person, a teenager in a Carhartt jacket, and shook him. "Answer me." His head turned slowly, eyes meeting hers, and Sarah saw that they were empty. Not the emptiness of unconsciousness, but the emptiness of absence, like looking into windows of a house with nobody home. The teenager's mouth opened and Sarah's voice came out. Freight 7 reporting passed through tunnel successfully. Then a woman's voice from the 1950s. "Made it to Whittier fine, no problems." Then a child's voice. "Daddy drove through the mountain and we had ice cream after." Dozens of voices, all reporting successful tunnel passages, all accounting for vehicles and people who'd never actually emerged, who sat here in this impossible place while their voices told the world that everything was fine. Sarah ran past them, past the 40 doors and the 50 doors and the 100 doors. The tunnel kept changing, cycling through its history and before its history, showing versions of itself that had never existed. A natural cave, a mine shaft, a subway tunnel from a city that wasn't Whittier, a passage through ice that glowed with its own light. The doors became more frequent, one every 10 feet, then one every 5 feet, until the tunnel walls were nothing but doors, hundreds of them, thousands all locked. She reached a section where the tunnel split into multiple passages, 3 tunnels where there should be one, then 5 tunnels, then dozens, a warren of passages branching in every direction, all identical, all lit with those flickering gas lamps. Sarah chose one at random, followed it, found it branching again. She was lost in a maze that shouldn't exist, running through tunnels that multiplied behind her and ahead of her, doors on every wall, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear traffic. Cars driving through, their engines echoing. Voices on CB radios reporting successful passages. They were driving through her. Sarah understood that suddenly and completely. The tunnel she was in existed in the same space as the real tunnel, occupying the same physical location but removed by 1 degree from reality. The cars driving through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel were driving through this space, through her space, but displaced just slightly, separated by a membrane she couldn't see or touch. And everyone who disappeared in the tunnel, the decades of missing vehicles and missing persons that nobody talked about because the tunnel was vital infrastructure and couldn't be closed. They were all here, all of them running through this maze, trying to find their way back. Sarah walked still. The tunnel has no end. When you drive through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel heading from Anchorage to Whittier or back, you might feel something. A momentary chill, a sense of someone running alongside your vehicle, a glimpse in your peripheral vision of doors in the walls where doors can't exist. That's Sarah and the others, still trying to get out, still trying to breach that invisible membrane and return to the real tunnel, the real world. Sometimes, rarely, the tunnel hiccups. A vehicle goes in and doesn't come out, and tunnel control finds empty road when they investigate, and eventually they mark it as a statistical error, an equipment malfunction, a vehicle that turned back before entering. The driver joins Sarah and the others in the maze, adds their voice to the radio transmissions that report successful passages while their bodies run through impossible tunnels forever, searching for doors that will open, for passages that lead somewhere besides more tunnel, for any way out of the space between spaces where the mountain caught them and won't let go. Story number 7, the Talkeetna Ice. Dr. Michael Okoye came to Alaska as part of a glaciology research team studying ice core samples from the Ruth Glacier. November 2019 found his team camped on the glacier 40 miles from Talkeetna, drilling into ice that had been accumulating for thousands of years, each layer a record of Earth's atmospheric history frozen in crystalline form. Michael was 34, Cambridge educated, and considered one of the world's leading experts on paleoclimate reconstruction. He drilled ice cores in Greenland, Antarctica, and the Tibetan Plateau. Alaska was supposed to be routine. The drill reached a depth of 2,800 feet on November 9th, penetrating ice that had formed during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. The core samples came up clean and clear, perfect specimens showing annual layers of snowfall compressed into solid ice. Michael's team cataloged and photographed each section, noting the presence of volcanic ash layers, pollen grains, and air bubbles that trapped ancient atmosphere. The anomaly appeared in core section 2,247. The ice was wrong. Instead of the expected uniform crystalline structure, this section showed irregular formations, almost cellular in appearance. Under microscopic examination, Michael saw structures that looked disturbingly organic, like preserved tissue rather than frozen water. He ran chemical analysis. The ice was water ice, H2O, nothing unusual. But something about the crystalline structure made his instruments give contradictory readings, as if the ice existed in multiple states simultaneously. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent listening to the glacier move beneath him, the constant groaning and creaking of ice under pressure, sounds that usually lulled him into unconsciousness. But tonight the sounds were different. He heard something that might have been breathing, massive and slow, each exhale lasting 30 seconds. Coming from below, coming from deep in the ice, he told himself it was auditory pareidolia, his brain finding patterns in random noise. But the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, and Michael swore he could feel vibrations through the tent floor timed to each breath. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and went to the drill site, intending to review the core samples again, to prove to himself they were just ice, just frozen water, nothing more. The drill tent was empty, the team's equipment exactly as they'd left it. Michael pulled out core section 2,047, shining his light through the ice. The cellular structures had changed. They were larger now, more defined, spreading through the ice like frost patterns on a window. As he watched, they moved, reorganizing, forming shapes that looked like organs, something that might have been a heart, something that might have been lungs, structures that served functions he couldn't identify. The ice was growing. Michael measured the core section. It was longer than it had been, extended by 6 inches, new ice forming at both ends, new cellular structures spreading through the material. Impossible. Ice didn't grow. Ice didn't develop structures. Ice didn't breathe. But the breathing sound was louder here, emanating from the core sample itself, from the ice in his hands. Michael dropped it, backing away. The section hit the floor and cracked, and something leaked out. Not water, but a liquid that was thicker, viscous, with a faint luminescence. It spread across the tent floor, moving against gravity, flowing uphill, pooling beneath the drill hole. Michael ran to wake the team leader, Dr. Patricia Chen. She followed him back to the drill tent, ready to laugh at his panic, to explain what he'd actually seen. But when they entered the tent, they found the drill hole had changed. It was wider, much wider. The ice around it melted back, and the hole descended into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate, darkness that seemed to actively repel illumination. The breathing sound came from the hole now, steady and massive. Each exhale bringing with it a smell like ozone and copper and something else. Something organic that had been frozen for 20,000 years and was now warming. Patricia grabbed the sat phone to call for evacuation. The phone showed no signal, despite being in line of sight with communication satellites. Their radios produced only static. The GPS units showed their location as the center of the Pacific Ocean. The glacier lurched beneath them, not the normal settling and movement of ice, but a deliberate shifting, like something rolling over in sleep. The drill tent collapsed, poles bending and fabric tearing. Michael and Patricia scrambled out into the night, joining the rest of the team who were emerging from their tents, shouting questions, trying to understand why the glacier was moving wrong. The drill hole was expanding, widening, ice melting around it at impossible speed despite the temperature being 30 below zero. The hole became a pit, then a crater, then a vast opening in the glacier 50 feet across and still growing. And something was rising from below, pushing up through 20,000 years of accumulated ice. Something that the ice had preserved and held and was now releasing. It came into view slowly, piece by piece, illuminated by their flashlights and the aurora that had begun dancing overhead. First, what might have been a hand, if hands were 20 feet across and had 7 fingers and were made of ice that moved like flesh. Then an arm, impossibly long, jointless, flowing. Then a body that made no sense, a mass of ice flesh that kept changing shape, forming and reforming, trying different configurations as if remembering how to be physical. The team ran. They grabbed their emergency packs and fled across the glacier, heading for the landing strip 3 miles away, where their bush pilot was supposed to pick them up in 4 days. Behind them, more of the creature emerged, a being that might have been alive when the ice was forming, when glaciers covered half the planet, a thing that had been frozen mid-transformation, and was now completing that transformation, becoming something adapted to a world that no longer existed. Michael looked back once. The creature was enormous now, rising hundreds of feet above the glacier, its body still forming, still trying different shapes. Sometimes humanoid, sometimes like a massive insect, sometimes like nothing that had ever lived on Earth. And it was aware. He could feel its attention, could feel it noticing him, recognizing him as the one who'd drilled down, who'd broken through the ice, who'd released it. The glacier cracked beneath their feet, fissures spreading, the entire surface fracturing as the creature moved. 2 of their team fell into crevasses that opened suddenly, their screams cut short. Michael and Patricia kept running, reaching the edge of the glacier where rock and ice met. They climbed down, hands bleeding on sharp stone, desperate to get off the ice to reach solid ground. They made it to the landing strip at dawn, collapsing on the gravel, lungs burning. Behind them, the Ruth Glacier was breaking apart, massive sections calving off and crashing down the valley. Clouds of ice crystals rising hundreds of feet into the air. And in the center of the destruction, the creature stood, fully formed now. A being made of living ice, crystalline and impossible, tall enough that its head disappeared into the clouds. The bush pilot refused to land. They heard him on the radio, his voice panicked, saying he could see something on the glacier, something huge, something that couldn't be real. He flew past without landing, returned to Talkeetna, and reported that the research team had radioed requesting delay due to weather. No mention of what he'd seen, no mention of the creature, because reporting it would mean explaining it. And explanation was impossible. Michael and Patricia hiked 40 miles back to civilization, taking 3 days, eating emergency rations, sleeping in snow caves, not talking about what they'd seen because words couldn't contain it. When they reached Talkeetna, they found the town acting like nothing had happened. No reports of glacial collapse, no seismic readings, no satellite imagery showing the destruction. But the Ruth Glacier is different now. Aerial surveys show it's shrinking faster than climate models predict, losing mass at an impossible rate, as if something is consuming it from within, eating the ice, growing. Climbers report hearing breathing sounds coming from deep crevasses, seeing movement beneath the surface, finding tracks in the snow that are too large and shaped wrong and don't lead anywhere, just appear and disappear as if something is learning to move through ice the way humans move through air. Michael doesn't work with ice cores anymore. He teaches now, stays in temperate climates, refuses any research that involves drilling into ancient ice. Because he knows what's down there, knows what's frozen in glaciers all over the world, waiting for the ice to melt, for someone to drill down, for the chance to wake up and remember how to be physical in a world that's warmed enough to receive them. The ice holds things. It preserves them. And as the planet warms and the glaciers retreat, those things are emerging piece by piece, specimen by specimen, breathing ancient air and remembering ancient purposes and reshaping themselves for a new world that they'll inherit from the humans who freed them.